A single kilogram of cocaine crosses the U.S. border. Within 48 hours, it will be cut, packaged, and sold in a dozen American cities. 3 people will overdose. 1 will die. But 5,000 years ago, this same plant was so sacred that Incan priests offered it to the sun god. This is the story of how that happened. The complete history of cocaine. 5,000 years from Incan gold to cartel wars. 25,000 Americans died from cocaine overdoses in 2023. Not from a virus. Not from a natural disaster. From a white powder derived from a plant that grows on mountain slopes in South America. A plant that indigenous peoples used safely for 5 millennia. A plant once prescribed by doctors, sold in pharmacies, and mixed into the most popular beverage in history. How does something sacred become something deadly? How does medicine become murder? How does a leaf chewed by Incan workers building Machu Picchu end up fueling cartel wars that have killed hundreds of thousands? This isn't a simple story of good and evil. It's a story of colonialism, capitalism, racism, and prohibition. It's about how Western science isolated and intensified a natural substance until it became something unrecognizable. How doctors called it a miracle, then a menace. How it became a status symbol, then a weapon of mass incarceration. How it made Pablo Escobar the 7th richest man in the world, while devastating entire communities. The coca plant didn't change over 5,000 years. Humans did. And the transformation tells us everything about power, greed, and the cost of the drug war. This is that story. The sacred origins 5,000 years ago, high in the Andes Mountains of South America. Indigenous peoples discovered something remarkable growing on the steep mountain slopes. A shrub with small green leaves that, when chewed, did something extraordinary. The leaves suppressed hunger, eased the pain of high altitude, and provided gentle energy for long days of work. The coca plant, Erythroxylum coca, native to the cloud forests and mountain valleys of what is now Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. Archaeological evidence shows coca use dating back to at least 3000 BCE. Ancient Peruvian mummies have been found with coca leaves in their burial pouches, placed there for the journey to the afterlife. That's how valuable this plant was. That's how sacred. By the time the Incan Empire rose to dominance in the 15th century, coca had become divine. The Incas called it the gift from Inti, the sun god himself. Coca wasn't just medicine or stimulant. It was a direct connection to the divine. Incan priests chewed coca leaves during religious ceremonies, offering them to the gods in elaborate rituals. The smoke of burning coca leaves carried prayers to heaven. Coca was so sacred that its use was restricted. Only nobility, priests, and imperial messengers, the chasquis who ran hundreds of miles carrying messages across the empire, were permitted to chew the leaves regularly. For common people, coca was reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, weddings, coming-of-age ceremonies. But there was one exception: hard labor. When the Inca needed workers to build the impossible, terraced farms carved into mountainsides, suspension bridges spanning canyons, stone cities perched on peaks, they gave workers coca. The leaves suppressed hunger during long days of physical labor. They eased the burning in lungs at high altitude. They provided endurance. Machu Picchu, the crown jewel of Incan architecture, was built by workers chewing coca leaves. Those massive stones, fitted together so precisely that a knife blade can't slip between them, were hauled up mountain paths by men whose stamina came partly from the sacred leaf. This was coca in its natural form. Whole leaves chewed slowly, mixed with lime or ash to release the alkaloids. The effect was mild, comparable to drinking strong coffee. There was no addiction epidemic, no overdoses, no crime, Coca was woven into the fabric of Andean culture as medicine, currency, and spiritual tool. The leaves were used to treat altitude sickness, digestive problems, and fatigue. They were offered as payment for labor. They were given as gifts to seal alliances. Coca leaves were red like tea leaves, their patterns predicting the future. Shamans used them in healing ceremonies. For thousands of years, this is what coca was, a plant that helped people survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Sacred, useful, harmless in the hands of people who understood and respected it. Then the conquistadors arrived. 1532, Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro and his small army encounter the vast Incan Empire. Within a year, through treachery and superior weaponry, they will conquer it, and they will discover coca. The Spanish reaction to coca is immediate and hostile. Catholic priests call it the devil's work, a pagan ritual that must be stamped out. The Church attempts to ban coca use, declaring it sinful. For the Spanish, coca represents everything wrong with indigenous culture. It's tied to non-Christian religious practices, and they don't understand it. But then the Spanish notice something interesting. Indigenous workers in the silver mines, forced into brutal labor by their conquerors, can work longer, harder, and with less food when they're given coca leaves. Workers who chew coca can spend 14 hours underground in toxic conditions, hauling or up narrow shafts, breathing poisonous dust. The Spanish position on coca reverses completely. Suddenly, coca isn't devil's work, it's an economic tool. The conquistadors and colonial administrators begin forcing indigenous miners to chew coca. They pay workers partly in coca leaves, creating dependency. The sacred gift of the sun god becomes a tool of colonial exploitation. The Catholic Church, which had condemned coca as pagan, now profits from it. The Church taxes the coca trade. 10% of all coca sales go to Rome. By the late 1500s, the Bishop of Cuzco earns more from coca taxes than from any other source. The institution that called coca sinful is now getting rich from it. This is the first corruption of coca, from sacred plant to instrument of oppression, from spiritual tool to economic exploitation. The Spanish take something indigenous peoples used sustainably for millennia and weaponize it. Spanish merchants ship coca leaves back to Europe, hoping to create a market. But coca leaves lose their potency during the long ocean voyage. Europeans who try chewing the dried, months-old leaves find them bitter and ineffective. Coca remains an Andean secret, unknown and unappreciated in Europe. For the next 3 centuries, coca stays primarily in South America. Indigenous peoples continue using it traditionally, despite colonial attempts to control it. The Spanish profit from the coca trade, but coca doesn't spread globally. It remains what it has always been, a regional plant with local significance. That changes in the 19th century, when European science discovers coca, and everything transforms. The miracle medicine, the 19th century, brings the age of chemistry. Scientists across Europe are isolating active compounds from plants, morphine from opium poppies, quinine from cinchona bark. These isolated alkaloids are far more potent than the raw plants. They can be standardized, measured, and prescribed with precision. In 1855, German chemist Friedrich Goethe becomes the first to isolate the active alkaloid from coca leaves. He extracts a substance he calls erythroxylene. But the process is imperfect, the yield small. 4 years later, in 1859, another German chemist named Albert Niemann refines the process. He produces a pure white crystalline powder from coca leaves. He names it cocaine. Cocaine is approximately 60 times more potent than chewing coca leaves. A small amount produces powerful effects: energy, euphoria, confidence, suppressed appetite. It's everything the coca leaf does, but concentrated and intensified. The scientific community takes notice. Here is a substance that seems to cure fatigue, boost mood, and enhance performance. Doctors begin experimenting with it. In 1863, a Corsican chemist and entrepreneur named Angelo Mariani creates something that will make him famous and wealthy. Vin Mariani. It's Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves, essentially wine with cocaine. Mariani markets it as a medicinal tonic for fatigue, depression, and general malaise. Vin Mariani becomes a sensation. It's endorsed by Pope Leo XIII, who awards Mariani a gold medal and appears in advertisements. Thomas Edison drinks it. Queen Victoria drinks it. President William McKinley, Jules Verne, Arthur Conan Doyle, Ulysses S. Grant all endorsed Vin Mariani. The Pope reportedly carried a flask of it. The marketing is brilliant, restores health, strength, energy, and vitality. Testimonials pour in from satisfied customers who feel energized and euphoric. Of course they do. They're drinking cocaine-laced wine. Pharmaceutical companies rush to create their own cocaine products. Cocaine appears in tonics, lozenges, tablets, powders, and wines. Parke-Davis, one of America's largest pharmaceutical companies, manufactures cocaine in multiple forms. Their catalog advertises cocaine as useful for treating hay fever, asthma, and throat problems. Cocaine is everywhere. It's in pharmacies, general stores, and mail-order catalogs. There are no prescriptions required, no age restrictions, no warnings. Cocaine is simply another medicine, like aspirin or cough syrup. This is the golden age of cocaine, when it's seen as a miracle, a gift from modern science. Doctors prescribe it enthusiastically. Patients buy it eagerly. No one yet understands the dangers. Or, if they do, they're not talking about it. 1884. A young Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud is struggling to make his mark in medicine. He's ambitious, brilliant, and looking for a breakthrough. When he reads about cocaine, he sees opportunity. Freud begins experimenting with cocaine on himself. He finds it remarkable. It lifts his mood, increases his energy, and helps him work longer hours. He gives it to his fiancée to improve her complexion. He gives it to friends and colleagues. In July 1884, Freud publishes Über Coca on coca, a glowing review of cocaine's therapeutic potential. He recommends cocaine for treating depression, anxiety, digestive problems, and, ironically, morphine addiction. He calls it a magical drug and suggests it has no significant side effects. Freud's reputation lends credibility to cocaine. If the future father of psychoanalysis endorses it, it must be safe. But Freud makes a critical mistake. He gives cocaine to his close friend Ernst von Fleschl-Marxow, who is addicted to morphine. Freud believes cocaine will cure the morphine addiction. Instead, Fleschl-Marxow becomes addicted to cocaine as well, using massive doses, experiencing paranoid delusions and hallucinations. He dies a few years later, his health destroyed. Freud quietly distances himself from cocaine advocacy. He stops writing about it, stops recommending it. But the damage is done. Cocaine is already mainstream. That same year, 1884, ophthalmologist Carl Kohler discovers that cocaine is an effective local anesthetic. When applied to the eye, it numbs tissue completely, allowing for painless surgery. This is revolutionary. Before cocaine, eye surgery was agonizing. Now it's routine. Cocaine, as a local anesthetic, is a legitimate medical breakthrough. It's still used in certain medical procedures today, specifically in nasal and throat surgeries, where its combination of numbing and vasoconstriction, narrowing blood vessels, is uniquely useful. But cocaine's medical uses are quickly overshadowed by its recreational appeal. In 1886, an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton creates a new beverage. He's trying to replicate the success of Vin Mariani. He mixes coca leaf extract with cola nut extract, which contains caffeine, sugar, and carbonated water. He calls it Coca-Cola. The early advertisements are explicit. Coca-Cola is a brain tonic and cure for headaches. It contains cocaine, not much, but enough to provide a mild stimulant effect. Combined with caffeine and sugar, it's energizing and mood-lifting. Coca-Cola becomes wildly popular. Soda fountains across America serve it. Children drink it. It's marketed as wholesome refreshment. The fact that it contains cocaine doesn't concern anyone. Cocaine is still considered safe. By the 1890s, cocaine is in everything. Park Davis sells cocaine cigarettes, marketed for throat problems and asthma. There are cocaine toothache drops for children. Advertisements show happy children with the tagline "Instantaneous Cure." There are cocaine nasal sprays, cocaine-laced cough syrups, cocaine suppositories. This is normal. This is mainstream. Walk into any pharmacy in 1895 and you'll find a dozen cocaine products. Doctors prescribe it routinely. Patients buy it without hesitation. But cracks are beginning to show. Chapter 5. The cracks appear by the late 1890s. Some doctors are noticing troubling patterns. Patients who use cocaine regularly are developing strange symptoms: paranoia, anxiety, insomnia, weight loss. Some become convinced that insects are crawling under their skin, a hallucination now known as cocaine bugs or formication. Overdoses are increasing. People are dying, their heart stopping from cocaine-induced cardiac arrest. Emergency rooms see patients with cocaine-induced psychosis, violent and delusional. Medical journals begin publishing warnings. In 1886, the same year Coca-Cola is invented, the medical journal The Lancet publishes a report on cocaine addiction. Doctors describe patients who can't stop using cocaine, who need increasingly large doses, who deteriorate physically and mentally. But cocaine is too profitable and too popular to stop. Pharmaceutical companies have invested heavily. Patients love it. Doctors are accustomed to prescribing it. Recreational use spreads beyond medicine. People discover that snorting pure cocaine powder produces an intense, immediate rush of euphoria. The effect is far more powerful than drinking cocaine-laced tonics. Snorting becomes the preferred method for non-medical users. A class divide emerges. Wealthy Americans continue using cocaine in respectable forms: tonics, wines, medicines. Working-class Americans and marginalized communities use cheaper, cruder forms. This divide will have enormous consequences. By 1900, cocaine's reputation is shifting. It's no longer just a miracle medicine. It's becoming associated with addiction, crime, and social disorder. The transformation from miracle to menace is beginning. And then racism accelerates everything. The demonization, the early 20th century in America, is a time of intense racial tension. The post-Reconstruction South is enforcing Jim Crow segregation through violence and law. White supremacy is openly defended by politicians, newspapers, and civic leaders. And cocaine becomes a weapon in the racist arsenal. In the early 1900s, newspapers in the South begin publishing sensational stories about Negro cocaine fiends. The stories are lurid and explicitly racist. Cocaine, they claim, makes black men violent, superhuman, and sexually aggressive toward white women. A 1914 article in the New York Times claims that cocaine gives black men superhuman strength and makes them immune to bullets. The article quotes a Southern police chief saying that officers had to switch to larger caliber weapons because cocaine-crazed black men couldn't be stopped by normal bullets. None of this is true. There is no evidence that cocaine makes anyone immune to bullets or grants superhuman strength. But the story spread, repeated in newspapers across the country. The narrative serves a purpose. It justifies violence against Black communities and provides a rationale for harsher policing. The racist panic around cocaine mirrors earlier panics around Chinese immigrants and opium. In both cases, drugs are used as a proxy for racial fear. The real target isn't the drug, it's the people associated with it. In 1903, under pressure from Southern racists and moral reformers, Coca-Cola removes cocaine from its formula. The company switches to spent coca leaves that have had the cocaine extracted but still provide flavoring. Coca-Cola still uses this process today, though few people know it. The removal of cocaine from Coca-Cola is presented as a health measure, but it's really about race. White Southern customers don't want to drink the same beverage associated with Black cocaine users. The medical establishment, which had enthusiastically promoted cocaine 20 years earlier, now joins the condemnation. Doctors who once prescribed cocaine for everything now warn of its dangers. The American Medical Association supports restrictions. But the shift isn't driven by new scientific evidence. It's driven by who is using cocaine. When wealthy white people used cocaine tonics, it was medicine. When poor Black people used cocaine, it became a menace. 1914, Congress passes the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. The law is ostensibly a tax regulation on opium and coca products, but its effect is to criminalize non-medical use of cocaine and opiates. Doctors can still prescribe cocaine, but only for specific medical purposes and with heavy documentation. The free-flowing cocaine market of the 1890s is over. Cocaine is removed from over-the-counter medicines. Pharmaceutical companies stop manufacturing most cocaine products. Cocaine goes underground. A black market emerges immediately. People who were buying cocaine legally from pharmacies now buy it from dealers. The price increases. Purity becomes inconsistent. Crime associated with the cocaine trade begins. This is the first American drug prohibition, and it sets a pattern that will repeat with marijuana, alcohol, and every subsequent drug war. Prohibition doesn't eliminate demand. It creates a criminal market. For the next 50 years, cocaine use drops significantly in the United States. It's overshadowed by other drugs: heroin, amphetamines, barbiturates. Cocaine becomes associated with a small subculture: jazz musicians, bohemians, artists. It remains illegal, but relatively rare. In the 1920s and 1930s, cocaine appears in jazz clubs in Harlem and New Orleans. Musicians use it for energy during long performances. The association with jazz, and therefore with Black culture, further cements cocaine's criminal status in the white mainstream imagination. During World War II, amphetamines largely replace cocaine as stimulants of choice. They're cheaper, legal with prescription, and favored by militaries on both sides of the war. Cocaine fades into obscurity. By the 1960s, cocaine is almost forgotten. Marijuana and LSD dominate counterculture drug use. Heroin is the hard drug that authorities fear. Cocaine is a relic of the past, a footnote in medical history. Then the 1970s arrive, and cocaine explodes back into American life with a vengeance. The epidemic, the 1970s, bring a cultural revolution. Disco, Studio 54, Wall Street excess. Cocaine fits perfectly into the era's aesthetic, glamorous, expensive, associated with success and hedonism. Cocaine makes a massive comeback. It's no longer the drug of jazz musicians and bohemians. It's the drug of bankers, celebrities, and professionals. It's called the champagne of drugs, a status symbol. Doing cocaine at a party signals that you've made it. Media portrayals reinforce this image. Cocaine is depicted as sophisticated, not dangerous. Magazine articles in the mid-1970s describe cocaine as non-addictive and relatively safe. A 1974 New York Times article quotes, "Doctors saying cocaine is probably the most benign of illicit drugs." Newsweek runs a cover story calling cocaine the drug of choice for millions. These claims are catastrophically wrong, but they shape public perception. If Newsweek says cocaine is safe, why not try it? By the late 1970s, an estimated 5.4 million Americans have tried cocaine. It's everywhere. Wall Street trading floors, Hollywood parties, disco bathrooms, college campuses. Cocaine spoons become jewelry. Cocaine mirrors and razor blades become chic accessories. The demand is astronomical. And where there's demand, someone will supply. Enter the Colombian cartels. Colombia has been growing coca for centuries. Indigenous communities in Colombian mountains cultivated it just as Peruvians and Bolivians did. But in the 1970s, Colombian criminal organizations industrialize cocaine production on a scale never seen before. The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, and the Cali cartel become the primary suppliers of cocaine to the United States. They develop sophisticated operations. Coca farms in the Colombian countryside, processing labs hidden in jungles, smuggling routes through Central America and the Caribbean, distribution networks in American cities. The profits are beyond imagination. Cocaine costs a few $100s per kilogram to produce in Colombia. It sells for $50,000 or more per kilogram in the United States. The markup is astronomical. The cartels are making billions. Pablo Escobar becomes the wealthiest criminal in history. Pablo Escobar is born into poverty in 1949 in Medellin, Colombia. He starts his criminal career stealing gravestones and selling them to smugglers. He moves into smuggling contraband goods. Then, in the mid-1970s, he discovers cocaine. Escobar is brilliant, ruthless, and ambitious. He builds the Medellin cartel into an empire. By the early 1980s, the Medellin cartel controls 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. Escobar is worth an estimated $30 billion, making him the seventh richest man in the world. He's not just a drug lord. He's a folk hero to many poor Colombians. Escobar builds housing for the poor, constructs soccer fields, and funds schools. He positions himself as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich via cocaine sales to Americans and giving to the poor. But Escobar is also a terrorist. His philosophy is simple: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Accept a bribe or take a bullet. Judges who refuse bribes are assassinated. Journalists who investigate the cartel are murdered. Politicians who oppose Escobar are killed along with their families. In 1985, Escobar's men stormed the Colombian Palace of Justice, taking the Supreme Court hostage. The siege ends with a building in flames and over 100 people dead, including 11 Supreme Court justices. The message is clear: no one is safe. Escobar orders the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, killing all 107 people aboard in an attempt to assassinate a presidential candidate who wasn't even on the plane. He bombs the DAS, Colombian Intelligence Agency, headquarters, killing 70 people. He sets off bombs in shopping centers, clubs, and streets. Colombia becomes a war zone. Between 1984 and 1993, cartel violence kills an estimated 4,000 people, including presidential candidates, journalists, judges, police officers, and civilians. The violence isn't confined to Colombia. Cartel operatives kill in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. Witnesses are murdered. Informants are tortured. The cartels bring a level of violence to the drug trade that America has never seen. And all of it is fueled by American demand. Every gram of cocaine snorted in a Manhattan bathroom, every line at a Hollywood party, every hit in a college dorm. It all connects back to the violence in Colombia. Americans are funding the war, even if they don't see the bodies. The U.S. government launches the war on drugs under President Reagan, pouring billions into interdiction, law enforcement, and military aid to Colombia. But the cocaine keeps flowing. The cartels are too wealthy, too sophisticated, too ruthless. And then, in the mid-1980s, something even more devastating arrives: crack cocaine. Crack cocaine is invented in the early 1980s. The process is simple. Mix cocaine powder with baking soda and water, heat it, and let it harden into rocks. These rocks can be smoked, and smoking cocaine produces an intense, immediate high, far more powerful than snorting. Crack has several characteristics that make it devastating. 1. It's cheap. A rock of crack costs $5 to $10, compared to $100 for a gram of powder cocaine. Poor communities can afford it. 2. It's intensely addictive. Smoking crack delivers cocaine to the brain in seconds, producing an overwhelming euphoria followed by a crash that creates immediate craving for more. 3. It's smokable. Smoking is more socially acceptable in some communities than injecting, and it's more efficient than snorting. Crack spreads through inner-city Black and Latino communities like wildfire. Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Washington, D.C. Crack devastates neighborhoods. Addiction rates soar. Crime increases as addicts steal to fund their habits. Families disintegrate. The Reagan administration responds with the harshest drug laws in American history. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 establishes mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. But the law contains a shocking disparity. Possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine carries the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. This is a 100:1 sentencing disparity. Crack, used primarily by poor Black Americans, is punished 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine, used primarily by wealthy white Americans. The result is mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale. Between 1980 and 2000, the U.S. prison population quadruples, going from 500,000 to over 2 million. Much of that increase is drug offenses, and Black Americans bear the brunt. By the 1990s, 1 in 3 young Black men is in prison on probation or on parole, primarily for drug offenses. Crack destroys communities, but the war on drugs destroys them further. Fathers are imprisoned for decades. Mothers lose custody of children. Young men are branded felons, unable to get jobs or housing. The cycle of poverty and incarceration becomes self-perpetuating. Meanwhile, a scandal emerges. Investigative journalist Gary Webb publishes a series of articles in 1996 alleging that the CIA facilitated cocaine trafficking into the U.S. to fund Nicaraguan Contra rebels. The CIA denies the allegations, but internal investigations later confirm that CIA assets were involved in drug trafficking, and the agency turned a blind eye. The government is fighting a war on drugs while facilitating the drug trade. The hypocrisy is staggering. The crack epidemic peaks in the early 1990s and then gradually declines not because of the war on drugs, but because communities adapt, treatment becomes more available, and the worst affected generation ages out. But the damage is done. Millions incarcerated, communities gutted, trust in government destroyed, and cocaine, both powder and crack, remains as available as ever. The modern ERA, December 2, 1993. Colombian police, with assistance from U.S. intelligence, track Pablo Escobar to a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. A gunfight erupts. Escobar is shot and killed on a rooftop trying to escape. His death is celebrated in Colombia and the United States. The most powerful drug lord in history is dead. Surely, the cocaine trade will collapse. It doesn't. The Medellin cartel fragments, but the Cali cartel immediately expands to fill the void. The Cali cartel is more sophisticated than Medellin, less violent, more corporate. They bribe politicians, infiltrate legitimate businesses, and use advanced technology. They're harder to fight because they're less visible. By the late 1990s, Colombian law enforcement, with massive U.S. assistance, dismantles the Cali cartel leadership. Again, there's celebration. Again, the cocaine trade continues. Power shifts to Mexico. Mexican cartels, which had been transporting Colombian cocaine through Mexico into the U.S., now take control of the entire operation. The Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco New Generation cartel, and others become more powerful than the Colombian cartels ever were. Mexican cartel violence eclipses even the worst of Colombia. Between 2006 and 2020, over 150,000 people are murdered in Mexico's drug war. Bodies are found decapitated, hung from bridges, dissolved in acid. Entire towns are terrorized. Journalists are killed at a rate higher than in war zones. Politicians are assassinated. The violence spills into Central America. The Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, becomes the murder capital of the world as cartels fight for control of smuggling routes. Hundreds of thousands of people flee north, seeking asylum in the United States, driven by cartel violence. Cocaine production doesn't decrease, it increases. Colombia produces more cocaine in 2020 than at any point in history. Over 2,000 metric tons per year. Coca cultivation spreads into previously untouched rainforests. The environmental destruction is catastrophic. Forests are cleared. Rivers are poisoned with the chemicals used to process cocaine. The cartels diversify. They're not just trafficking cocaine anymore. They control heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl markets. They've evolved into transnational criminal organizations with operations on every continent. And the cycle continues. Demand in wealthy countries, supply from poor countries, violence in between. Cocaine use is rising again, especially in Europe. The United Kingdom has the highest rate of cocaine use in Europe. Spain's coastline is flooded with cocaine shipments from South America. Cocaine purity on European streets is higher than ever, making it more dangerous. In the United States, cocaine overdose deaths are spiking, not because cocaine itself is more lethal, but because it's increasingly contaminated with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. Users think they're snorting cocaine. They're actually ingesting a lethal dose of fentanyl. Thousands die. Social media has transformed drug dealing. Dealers advertise on Instagram and Snapchat using emojis and coded language. Transactions happen via encrypted apps. The drug trade has gone digital. Designer cocaine culture has returned. Wealthy users in New York, London, and Dubai treat cocaine as a luxury product, like expensive wine. There are cocaine sommeliers who claim to distinguish between different regions and processing methods. The glamorization of the 1970s is back. Meanwhile, coca farmers in the Andes remain desperately poor. They grow coca because it's the only crop that provides enough income to survive. Governments eradicate coca fields, but farmers simply replant in more remote areas. The war on drugs targets the poorest link in the chain, while the cartels and wealthy users remain largely untouched. The cost of cocaine prohibition is staggering. Hundreds of billions spent on enforcement, hundreds of thousands killed in cartel violence, millions incarcerated, and cocaine more available than ever. Every strategy has failed. Crop eradication doesn't work. Farmers replant. Interdiction doesn't work. Cartels find new routes. Arresting dealers doesn't work. New dealers replace them immediately. The war on drugs has been fought for 50 years, and cocaine has won. Some countries are trying different approaches. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, treating addiction as a health issue rather than a crime. Overdose deaths dropped. HIV transmission dropped. Drug use didn't increase. But the United States and most other countries continue the same failed strategies. The question no one wants to answer: what if prohibition is the problem? 5,000 years. From the sacred slopes of the Andes to the blood-soaked streets of Medellin. From Incan priests offering coca to the sun god to cartels murdering journalists. From Victorian pharmacies to crack houses. From miracle medicine to global catastrophe. The coca plant didn't change. Humans did. For millennia, indigenous Andean peoples used coca sustainably. They chewed the leaves in moderation, integrated it into their culture, and never experienced the devastation we see today. Coca was a gift. It helped them survive in harsh conditions, connected them to the divine, and brought communities together. Then Europeans arrived. They saw a resource to exploit. Spanish conquistadors forced indigenous miners to chew coca so they could extract more silver. The sacred became a tool of oppression. Then scientists arrived. They isolated cocaine, concentrated it, and turned a mild stimulant into a powerful drug. Western medicine praised it as a miracle, prescribed it widely, and created the first wave of cocaine addiction. Then racists arrived. They used cocaine as a weapon against Black Americans, fabricating stories of cocaine fiends to justify violence and oppression. Cocaine was criminalized not because of science, but because of who was using it. Then prohibitionists arrived. They banned cocaine, creating a black market that would eventually be controlled by the most violent criminal organizations in history. Prohibition didn't stop cocaine use. It made it deadly. Then cartels arrived. They industrialized cocaine production, making billions while leaving a trail of bodies across 2 continents. Pablo Escobar, the Cali cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, each more sophisticated and violent than the last. And through it all, demand never stopped. Americans and Europeans kept snorting cocaine, kept funding the violence, kept pretending they weren't connected to the murders in Colombia and Mexico. Every gram of cocaine tells a story. It connects a Wall Street bathroom to a Colombian jungle lab, a London nightclub to a mass grave in Mexico, a sacred Andean leaf to a grieving mother whose son was killed by cartels. The cartels didn't create the cocaine trade. Demand did. Western demand. Wealthy demand. Our demand. The war on drugs has cost over $1 trillion and accomplished nothing except mass incarceration and empowered cartels. We've arrested millions, imprisoned hundreds of thousands, and cocaine is cheaper, purer, and more available than ever. The failure is complete, but we continue the same policies, expecting different results. Some argue for harsher enforcement, but we've tried that. We've militarized police, sent troops to South America, sprayed coca fields with poison, built walls, and increased sentences. None of it worked. The cartels adapt faster than governments can respond. Some argue for treatment and harm reduction. Portugal's decriminalization model shows promise. Treating addiction as a medical issue rather than a crime reduces deaths and doesn't increase use. But political will for such approaches remains weak in most countries. Some argue for legalization and regulation. If cocaine were legal, regulated, and taxed like alcohol, the cartels would lose their revenue stream overnight. But the political obstacles are enormous and the risks uncertain. What's clear is that the current approach has failed catastrophically. The question is whether we have the courage to admit it. The story of cocaine reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. It shows how colonialism extracts and exploits indigenous resources, how capitalism turns everything into a commodity, how racism shapes drug policy, how prohibition creates the very problems it claims to solve, how demand in wealthy countries causes death in poor countries. It shows the cost of refusing to learn from history. We prohibited alcohol in the 1920s, empowering organized crime and causing violence. Then we repealed prohibition, and the violence ended. Yet we continue prohibiting drugs, empowering cartels, and wondering why the violence continues. The coca plant, in its natural form, was harmless. Indigenous peoples used it for 5,000 years without the problems we see today. The problem isn't the plant, it's what we did to it. We isolated it, concentrated it, industrialized it, criminalized it, and created a monster. And now we're trapped in a cycle. Demand drives supply, supply drives violence, violence drives enforcement, enforcement drives prices up, high prices drive more violence. Round and round, with no end in sight. The human cost is incalculable. The coca farmers in Bolivia and Peru who live in poverty while risking arrest. The Colombian and Mexican communities terrorized by cartel violence. The journalists murdered for reporting the truth. The politicians assassinated for standing up to cartels. The police officers killed in the line of duty. The addicts who die from contaminated cocaine. The families destroyed by incarceration. The children who grow up without parents because of the drug war. Every line of cocaine snorted at a party connects to this suffering. Every gram purchased funds the cartels. Every user, whether they acknowledge it or not, is part of the system. This isn't a moral judgment, it's a fact. The cocaine trade exists because of demand. If demand disappeared, the cartels would collapse. But demand won't disappear through prohibition. A century of evidence proves that. The tragedy is that we know the answers. We know prohibition doesn't work. We know treatment is more effective than incarceration. We know the war on drugs has failed. But we lack the political courage to change course. So the cycle continues. Coca farmers plant their crops because they have no alternative. Cartels process and smuggle cocaine because the profits are astronomical. Users consume cocaine because it's available and they want it. Governments arrest and imprison people because that's the only policy they know. And the violence continues. The deaths continue. The suffering continues. For 5,000 years, coca was sacred. Then, in less than 2 centuries, we turned it into one of the deadliest commodities on earth. Not because the plant changed, but because we did. The Incan priests who offered coca to Inti would be horrified by what their sacred plant has become. The Victorian doctors who prescribed cocaine as miracle medicine would be shocked by the epidemic they helped create. The jazz musicians who used cocaine recreationally in the 1920s couldn't have imagined Pablo Escobar's reign of terror. And Pablo Escobar himself, for all his brutality, was just responding to the massive demand created by prohibition. Each generation thought they understood cocaine. Each was wrong. The sacred became profitable. The profitable became criminal. The criminal became catastrophic. And here we are in 2024 with more cocaine production than ever, more deaths than ever, more violence than ever, and the same failed policies. The question isn't whether cocaine is dangerous. It clearly is. The question is whether our response to that danger has made things better or worse. The evidence suggests we've made things catastrophically worse. Prohibition created the cartels. The cartels created the violence. The violence created the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis creates political instability. And through it all, cocaine remains as available as ever. What if we're wrong? What if everything we've been told about drug policy is backwards? What if prohibition is the problem, not the solution? These are uncomfortable questions. They challenge decades of policy, billions in spending, and deeply held beliefs about crime and punishment. But if we're serious about reducing harm, we have to ask them. The story of cocaine is a warning. It shows what happens when we refuse to learn from history, when we let racism shape policy, when we prioritize punishment over treatment, when we attack supply while ignoring demand, when we wage war on plants and people instead of addressing root causes. From Incan gold to cartel wars, this is the price of prohibition. This is the cost of the drug war. This is what happens when we turn the sacred into the criminal. The coca plant still grows in the Andes, just as it has for millions of years. Indigenous peoples still chew coca leaves, just as their ancestors did. The plant hasn't changed. But the world around it has been transformed by greed, violence, and failed policy. And until we acknowledge that transformation, until we admit that our approach has failed and find the courage to try something different, the cycle will continue. More deaths, more violence, more incarceration, more suffering, and cocaine, always cocaine, flowing from the mountains of South America to the cities of the world, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake.